22 million black victims of Americanism are waking up, and they're gaining a new political consciousness, becoming politically mature. And as they develop this political maturity, they're able to see the recent trends in these political elections. Any minority that has a block of votes that stick together is in a strategic position. Either way you go, that's who gets it. You're in a position to determine who go to the White House and who stay in the doghouse. You're the one who has that power. You and I have never seen democracy. All we've seen is hypocrisy. When we open our eyes today and look around America, we see America not through the eyes of someone who has enjoyed the fruits of Americanism. We see America through the eyes of someone who has been the victim of Americanism. We don't see any American dream. We've experienced only the American nightmare. We haven't benefited from America's democracy. We've only suffered from America's hypocrisy. And the generation that's coming up now can see it and are not afraid to say it. 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 And are not afraid to say it.
And are not afraid to say it. Welcome, welcome, welcome. You are tuned in to Black Westchester Presents, the People Before Politics radio show, episode 312. I'm your host, AJ Woodson. Damon K. Jones is not with us today. Shout out to my partner, Damon, as we celebrate our 7-year anniversary. The newspaper is out on the streets now and in digital form online. You have not seen it, let me know. If you have an event coming up, we have plenty of copies. You can come by and pick them up for your event or for your business. Let me welcome on to the show my partner, co-host, Dr. Robert Baskerville.
Who's a little off screen. Hey, what's up, AJ? How are you today, man?
What's going on, sir? What's going on?
Good, I'm good.
Bob has put together a really good show, What's that comedian say? Oh, we got a really good show, I forget what comedian that was. Anyway, I got to say a couple of things real quick. So last week's show, we reviewed the verses, and I had Ray I had him do a review of the Nas album. Now, being a true hip hop head, I asked him for a review, like the Source used to have 5 mics, and we do the fist in the air, so he gave it 5 fists. For me, an album that has 5 mics or 5 fists is the flawless classic album. Every song is could be a single by itself, great transition, everything. I do not believe Nas' album was 5. I give it a 4, but I don't, as the professional hip hop junkie, as a hip hop purist, I cannot give the album a 5. There's some cuts I could do without in the beginning, but the album grows and Hip Boy's production grows. So just so to keep my, I have to say that I don't know if it's a 5. That was his review, but Black Westchester, we give it a 4. Which is still a great album. I think it's a great album and everybody should go out and buy it. So I just wanted to say that. Bob, have you been up to anything you want to say before we get into the show?
Just, doing work, brother. That's it. I'm enjoying the last few weeks before the start of the semester. As many of our audience members are aware, we're trying to return to some degree of normalcy with the start of the new semester this fall. And that's certainly the case at Bronx Community College, where I'll be returning to teach in-person classes, and so just getting myself ready for that, and working on other projects that I have that I've been involved with, including the project that brings us to tonight's show. Tonight we have 2 persons who are integral to a new project that several organizers in the Mount Vernon area have been working on, and so I don't know.
Before you do that, I just want to explain, because I get it's been a little confusion. So with the anniversary thing going on. So we're celebrating 3 separate anniversaries. Last month in July was the official 7-year anniversary of the online site Black Westchester Magazine, the African American news magazine that we started somewhere around July 15th. So that was the 7-year anniversary of that. The beginning of August is the 7-year anniversary of this radio show. And on our 3-year anniversary, we were encouraged to start a newspaper. So this month is the 4-year anniversary of the physical print newspaper. I know a lot of people gave us congratulatory ads and they saw 4 and 7. They were a little confused. So I just wanted to shout out Dee. She said happy anniversary. And I thought I just wanted to put up that clarification. So yes, last month we celebrated the 7-month anniversary of Black Westchester Magazine. This month we're celebrating the 7-year anniversary of this radio show, People Before Politics, and the 4-year anniversary of the physical Black Westchester newspaper. And without further ado, I pass the microphone to you, Dr. Bob.
Yeah, so as everyone knows, for some time now, I've been working on the startup of a grassroots think tank named Rise Up Research Initiatives for the Strategic Empowerment of the Urban Populace. It has a multidimensional program that focuses on trying to provide strategic information to organizers, social entrepreneurs in America's central cities so that we can devise more effective policies in order to address the pressing needs of our community. One aspect of that program that we have includes popular education. And as part of it, we are launched in partnership with the Mount Vernon Library, a lecture series entitled Decipher. Decipher will bring to the library a number of the nation's and world's leading scholars on Black history and life. And to launch the inaugural presentation, we have with us Dr. Jeffrey B. Perry, who is the author of the 2-volume biography on one of the most influential, although less known, African-American radical or Black radical intellectuals and organizers from the 20th century, Hubert Harrison. And in addition, we also have with us another vital partner in this effort, Mount Vernon Library Director, Timor Davis. And so thanks to both of them, we're looking forward to a really invigorating, spirited speaker series that hopefully will not only provide us with education about figures who are often neglected in our schools, but in addition to that, provide us with some historical lessons that we can draw on as we seek to continue that tradition of struggle in the face of a number of rather unnerving developments and forces that have now risen in the United States and across the globe. So on that note, I guess I've said enough. I got to figure out how to stop sharing the screen. Okay, here we go. Oh, thank you, AJ.
So what I'm going to do first, since the event is coming up, I'm going to bring in some more. Welcome to the show.
Hey, how you doing? Hey.
The director of the Mount Vernon Public Library. And I'm going to let the two of y'all talk about the upcoming show, and then we're going to bring the author, Jeffrey.
So Timor, welcome, brother. It's good to have you on air with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you allowing me to actually become part of this significant show of not only the Mount Vernon community, but also Westchester County and the state of New York as well. Thank you so much.
Well, absolutely. And I have to say that we are also thankful to have such a willing partner in a library director in order to undertake what is really a rather unconventional kind of program, if you will. Mount Vernon.
I just want to say, and thank you for those kind words, Mr. Davis. And we didn't even pay him. The checks in the mail, we greatly appreciate those kind words. Go ahead, Bob.
So Timor, to start with, man, many people know you as the newly hired director of the Mount Vernon Library. And although you do have all of the credentials and background training that one would expect in a librarian, in my conversations with you, as we've been organizing together the library series, I really came to find out that your background extends well beyond what you would expect of a librarian. In fact, our first conversation I was absolutely bowled over by the extensive knowledge that you have in one of my areas of specialization, Black intellectual history, and came to learn that you are part of that tradition of Black bibliophiles that can be traced back to Arthur Schomburg, one of the inspirations for the founding of the Schomburg Library, and who you've written a small volume on yourself. So, could you just give us a little bit more background about, who you are and how you came to be a librarian, and some of the other work that you've done outside of the library as part of this tradition of radical Black intellectual study and scholarship?
Well, first and foremost, my name is Timor Davis, and I am proud to meet the community of Mount Vernon. Due to COVID, I have not had the chance to actually formally meet the public, so I'm looking forward for every possible opportunity to assist in meeting the public and sharing ideas and actually learning from the public as well. My background in library science goes far back as when I was 5 years old. My father was a member of the Nation of Islam, and so there was a plethora of books and materials that I was raised around as a young lad. And the family eventually migrated from Brooklyn, New York. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York, and we moved into Newark, New Jersey. And while in Newark, New Jersey, my grandfather was a noted pastor or preacher in the city of Newark, Seventh-day Adventist pastor. And so I would always see as a child, whether it's with my father, my mother, what have you, a plethora of books around the house. In addition to the books, whether it's about history books, medical books, so on and so forth, my mother was a noted artist. She had got matriculated into Pratt Institute as a young child at the age of 16. And I later found out in life that there's a whole slew of family members that were artists and artisans, that actors and actresses. My great aunt was in movies with Richard Roundtree as an actress. My aunties, my great aunties actually went to the University of Buffalo, and I found out that they were all artists, but because of the fact that we moved into Newark, I didn't have a real strong link with the family. Moving fast forward into as a young lad, my grandmother always made it imperative, very important, to go back and forth to the library and to have a library card, because having a library card to my grandmother was better than having an actual credit card. You just have to return the books on time. So, but and as a young child, there was I grew up in Newark, and where the late Amir Baraka had his programs and his community engagement on 808 South 10th Street in Newark, New Jersey. I grew up maybe a mile or two down, and I would actually befriend some of Baraka's children, Mitty, Raz, so on and so forth. I would go to the poetry sessions, meet a lot, Sonia Sanchez, whole lot of people I've met. And so I explained to my mother, figure that I should become a librarian because I love books. And in my discussion with, one brief discussion I had with Amiri, Imamo, he said, well, not too many Black men are becoming librarians. That's what you should do. So, in Newark, at Newark Public Library, there was a lot of prominent people coming back and forth that was working on the Harry Pulaski's book entitled The African American History Almanac. I met and befriended and became part of projects with the late Dr. John Henrik Clark, met and talked to Ivan Van Sertima, had great scholars at the Essex County College, Jersey City State College, and also graduate schools. I met some of the leading scholars in the field of Africana studies, Africana cultural studies and development, Latin American studies, and so on and so forth. So, in reading about Schomburg at Arts High School, and Arts High School was one of the prominent high schools in Newark, a magnet high school. Went to school with Savion Glover and some other people, noted artists. And I read the book by J. Rogers entitled World's Greatest Men of Color, second volume. If I'm not mistaken, page 451 of the book, there was a essay on Schomburg entitled The Sherlock Holmes of Black History. I read the essay, And in reading the essay, and then I had a whole slew as a graffiti artist, as a known urban artist, as a young child. I was a part of different graffiti crews, and we was engaged in different philosophies, whether it was 5% Nation, whether it was Christianity, Islam. We was reading a lot of different material. And one of my friends said, this is what you need to do, because he said, well, you always gathering information for the group. You're always going into the library, looking at the annotated bibliographies, the books about the books. This is something that you may want to do. I said, well, I don't know. I was thinking more in terms of becoming a historian. So lo and behold, I go to Jersey City State College. I'm in school. I had a independent study program to graduate, and I had passed with flying colors because I understood annotated bibliography, no matter what style it was in, whether it was Chicago style, the APA writing style, the MLA writing style. I knew it like the back of my hand, and I studied that. I would sit there and read annotated bibliographies. The professor said of this, Dr. Robert Turner, if I'm not mistaken, he had the program at the Jersey City State College. He spoke to the head of the library at Newark Public Library, and then that's when I started getting on my way, and I ended up in Pratt, and here I am today. But I know that this is my life career, my life goal, in terms of being a librarian. In terms of engaging as a librarian, I worked on projects with Maya Angelou. I worked on numerous different projects, but noted figures, whether it was Tupac's Thug Angels project as a researcher in the background, or many different types of intellectual projects with different noted rap groups, stuff like that. They would actually come to me in the library and ask me about copyright information, trademark information, whereby a lot of those young people thought it was boring. I love reading that particular type of information. I love reading about how to actually protect your intellectual property, which goes hand in hand with librarianship. So this is my life goal. This is what I plan to do. And reading about Schomburg and meeting noted scholars from Trust, layman scholars. I eventually get to meet Dr. Perry at East Orange Public Library while he was doing a lecture about Hubert Henry Harrison. And I was familiar with the name of Hubert Henry Harrison because that was part of what we were talking about and some of the informal intellectual groups that I was a part of, from African Echoes to St. Rocco's groups to going to the Slave Theater in Brooklyn, New York, so on and so forth, stuff like that. And here I am today, still carrying out my goals and objectives to be able to make sure I serve the people in the community to help advance them culturally, economically, politically, and otherwise.
Well, now I want to transition. I want to bring in our next guest, and I want to have y'all talk about this upcoming event at the library, how y'all put it together, and I'd like to introduce our next guest. There he goes. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, AJ and Dr. Bob and Timor. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for sharing some time with me, but most importantly, for bringing Hubert Harrison to your audience. I think this is really important work you're doing. I think the plan is we're going to do a more in-depth discussion of Hubert Harrison and his life and work, where we can have a lot of participation. I think that's, Timor, that's what you got, Rob, that's what you got in a plan. Yeah. And I'm enthusiastic about such a plan. I've been working on Harrison since about 1980. 40 years, and traveled all over, a lot of research, much research, and the 2-volume biography, which you can see here, and Rob, you might have the slide, I think you might have thrown it up. I completed a 2-volume biography recently on Hubert Harrison. I believe it is the first full-length multi-volume biography of an Afro-Caribbean, and only the 4th of an African-American, after those of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Langston Hughes. Hubert Harrison is a giant of Black history, and unfortunately, most people don't know very much about him, although that's beginning to change. I've started on one of my talks where I open up with 15 minutes on Harrison. We've been getting 3,000 views a day now. It's up to almost 200,000 on YouTube. And it's picking up. He's now on the wall at the National Museum in Washington, D.C., and he's they have him featured near you folks at the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, his gravesite marker. And, people are paying more and more attention to Hubert Harrison, as it should be. And why? Very briefly, and we can go into this, but J.A. Rogers, in the book that Timor mentioned, describes Hubert Harrison. Harrison lives from 1883 to 1927, and he's described as the foremost Afro-American intellect of that period. Pretty high praise, right? Du Bois is in that period, a lot of other people. And A. Philip Randolph refers to him as the father of Harlem Radicalism. So already you've got a unique combination of intellectual and radical. He is the major radical influence on both A. Philip Randolph and Marcus Garvey. This is extraordinary that people didn't know more about him, right? When I first started researching him, if I Googled his name, I think I came up with 700 views. At that time, Garvey had almost 1,000 times that. Du Bois had 1,500 times that. It's changing now, and it's changed. And there's reasons we can go into why he's not better known. But he was, just a little more brief intro, he was the leading Black activist in the Socialist Party for a while. He came up with some very important insights and offered direction for the left in this country. But he wound up breaking from them because he thought that the white labor movement and the white socialists put the white race first before class. Then he dug deep and he focused work in the African-American community, in the Black community, and he becomes the founder of what he refers to as the Militant New Negro Movement. It's a total break from what had been going on before, and this precedes Alain Locke's New Negro by a decade or something, and it's political and it's literary, and he founds the first newspaper, The Voice, and the first organization, the Liberty League. Marcus Garvey joins Harrison's organization. For those familiar with Garvey, he doesn't join anyone's organization, right? And so he founds that. Then he subsequently founds the New Negro, a journal of the international consciousness of the Negro race, right, in 1919. He writes When Africa Awakes. Here we go. He writes When Africa Awakes, the inside story of the stirrings and strivings of the new Negro in the Western world. That's in 1920. Again, 5 years before Alain Locke. And then he subsequently, after this, Garvey asks him to work on his newspaper, The Voice, and he becomes the principal managing editor of that paper in 1920 when it sweeps the globe. He's a great journalist. He also is an extraordinary speaker. He goes down, when he's with the Socialists back in 1912, he goes down to the corner of Broad and Wall Street in front of the stock exchange at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and he starts speaking on socialism to an audience as far as The Voice could reach, according to the New York Times. And he spoke for 3 hours. They'd never seen anything like this. He spoke before 50,000 people at Union Square. He pioneers soapbox oratory throughout Manhattan and many other places, or around the country even, because he travels. He's a brilliant orator. 134th Street at Harlem Community Board 10 voted unanimously to name that corner after him, but it's not been implemented. But he's a brilliant soapbox orator, brilliant editor, brilliant writer, brilliant political activist. And after he has some differences with Garvey, and he leaves, and he then sets out on his own, and he's a wide-ranging journalist on lots of topics. He's the first Black educator, speaker and educator for the New York City Board of Education, their evening series. He's a great bibliophile. He loves the Free Public Library. He is on the founding committee with Schomburg of the Committee on Negro Prints and Literature, which grows into the Schomburg Center. And he's one of the founding officers. And he believed free public libraries are one of the great institutions in this country. Ernestine Rose, who was one of the librarians at that library, said she had never had anyone who read as many books or took out as many books as Hubert Harrison. And he wrote series up for the Boston Chronicle up in Boston, and he accomplished all these major things, but he dies young in 1927, relatively suddenly. And then shortly thereafter, the silence came down on him, and we can go into why the silence came down. But in general, he was a very direct speaking, forthright. He would speak his mind. He'd speak openly and critically, not mean-spirited, but he would try and push the struggle for Black liberation forward. And he, so some people were stung by that. But
now I want to reverse a little bit. I want to talk a lot more about Hubert Harrison and the new Negro movement. But before we go any further, and I probably should have did this in the beginning, introduce yourself. Let everybody know who you are.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'm born in the Bronx, utterly working class roots. I don't think any of my direct descendants, I know none of them went to college, and I don't think any of them ever finished high school. My family moved out to Jersey. I did okay in school. I played sports. I got to go to good colleges, but I started getting active. I was born in 46, and it was the 60s when I'm coming of age. And I started getting involved in lots of left groups and organizations. And, I was doing that, and I did work with Black Panthers, with the Puerto Rican movement, with the Asian movement, with the labor movement, all these different groups. And at a certain point, I decided I had a certain responsibility to do work in the labor movement. So I went into the post office. I was living in Jersey City at the time. We had a big 4,000 worker facility, and I worked there. We had strikes against the government. Quite a number of people got fired. That was in 1978. But I continued. We plowed ahead, and I got elected to various offices in the union, and ultimately became the treasurer of the local. But I edited at every local, at the branch, at the local, at the national level. I edited the papers, and along the way, I started going back to school, and I was working. I did labor studies at Rutgers, and then I did American history at Columbia, and I studied under Nathan Huggins and Hollis Lynch, two outstanding historians. Huggins went on to found what's now the Du Bois Institute at Harvard, and Lynch, his daughter, is a great he's got two daughters. One's a great filmmaker. The other one works at the Schomburg Center, and he's from Trinidad and Tobago, actually. I stopped down at his place some years later, and I worked under them, and I was working, and I was trying. I also in this period came under the influence of a man named Theodore W. Allen, who, if people are not familiar with him, he lived in Brooklyn. He was a former coal miner, like Harrison, and like me. He was more or less a working class intellectual, anti-white supremacist, and Allen, like Harrison, was a true autodidactic all the way through, never went to college, although he was brilliant. And he had pioneered a class struggle approach to white skin privilege in the mid-60s. That's 20 years before all this stuff that came out later. Very different, much deeper in its analysis. But his most important work were 2 volumes on the invention of the white race. And I'm just doing yet a 3rd edition for Verso Books in Brooklyn of that. We're going to put both volumes in one by the end of this year. And Allen's books have had tremendous influence. They're selling very well. And that's the video. I've done numbers of videos. By the way, on my webpage, jeffreybperry.net, listeners, readers, people can see whatever they want about me. I mean, it's pretty much up there, and it's all for free. It's everything I can put up there for free, I do. And so I came under the influence of Allen, and one of the key things about Allen was he emphasized that the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy, it was the key to serious social change in the U.S. No ducking the issue at all. This is it. We got to take this one on. And so I was influenced by that, and I was working under Huggins and Lynch at Columbia University towards a doctorate. And I came across 3 articles that mentioned Hubert Harrison, one by J.A. Rogers in World's Great Men of Color, another by Richard B. Moore, another great Black activist and writer who ran the 125th Street bookstore in his later life, but had been active with the African Blood Brotherhood, Socialist Party, Communist Party, and many other groups for West Indian Federation and things, and whose daughter, by the way, Joyce Moore Turner, I stay in touch with. She's over 100 now, and she still writes articles published in academic journals. She's great, and she's the kind of friend you want. She'll give you straight answers, straight objective. She's not going to just play nice with you, if you give her an article to look at. And then the third article was by a labor historian, Philip Foner, and they all mentioned Hubert Harrison. And I said, who is this guy? Because there hadn't been much about him. So I went up to the Schomburg Library, and Harrison had written 2 books, The Negro and the Nation in 1917, and When Africa Wakes in 1920. And back then, you had to print them off a microfiche or something like that. And I took them home and I read them, and I stopped everything I was doing because he was the clearest thinker I had come across. And I'm a very rigorous researcher. You might sense it with all these books here, very serious. And he was the clearest thinker by far of the early left radicals, and particularly on the questions of race and class. So I said, wow, I'm going to write on this guy. And then I sent out letters, because back then it was innovative. You could type a letter and you could change who it was going to. And I sent out about 35 letters, and a librarian, once again, the librarians come through, from St. Thomas, wrote back and said she was related to his family, and his son was living on 150th off Bradhurst in Harlem, and his daughter was living up on Pelham Road in New Rochelle. So here the story comes closer to you folks, right? And that was his daughter, Ada. So I went and met them both. And at first they said, man, what do you want to write about our dad for? And I understood all that. I'd been around a little bit. And, on the third meeting, I had left them 3 chapters. And then they took me into the front room. You come in the back, the front room of a railroad flat, this apartment on 150th Street. And up in the closet, they had preserved essentially in that apartment since 1927, when Harrison died, all his papers. And his papers, and then they said to me, take these and do with them what you need to do. And I was overwhelmed that they trusted me that much, and I became an archivist overnight. Maybe not to the skill of Timor, but I worked at it hard. I got the acid-free paper, the archival boxes, the works. And then I'd come home because I'm working full time, and I'd transcribe articles every day. And along the way, I became a soccer dad. My daughter was growing up and playing soccer, so I had a full plate. But I stayed on it, and so that's in root and basically how I come out of it. But I come from a background of activism. Always in my work, I try to focus on the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy. And Harrison and Allen, the 2 people I focus on, I think are 2 of the most important thinkers and writers on race and class in the 20th century. And I encourage your listening audience to become more familiar with them. And again, if they go to my webpage, they'll see lots of info. And that video, as we're talking, is going to be hitting about 200,000 in another day, I think. It's a 2-hour video. It's not a short one. It's a 2-hour video, slides, very interesting, I think. Okay, AJ?
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Bob.
Unmute, Bob.
As a fellow academic, I've had an opportunity to familiarize myself with many of the earlier chapters of African American history, and specifically intellectual history, and its intersection with American politics. But many of our viewers, haven't had the same level of formal education and may be unfamiliar with some of the terms that you referred to, and also the circumstances that led to Harrison's original immigration to the United States during the late 19th century. As you know, the historian Rayford Logan referred to this period as the nadir to really signify the remarkable deterioration in the social and political conditions that African Americans encountered shortly after the rollback of radical Reconstruction. So if you could you tell us, for one, about his early formative years, first as in the Caribbean, and then the circumstances that led to his migration here in the United States, along with many other a wave of Caribbean immigrants, and what was going on that shaped his thinking and eventually led him to embrace a life as a radical intellectual and organizer.
Excellent question. Harrison was born in St. Croix, which was Danish West Indies at that time, Caribbean island. He was born in 1883. His mom was from Barbados, a plantation worker. His father had been born enslaved in St. Croix, so he had, roots deep into the working class, if you will. And his father dies. They were never married. His biological father and mother were never married. And he lives on the plantation in the early years, but it was a plantation. Even on the plantation, he got to know people from other islands. The plantation, he was State Concordia, had a mix of peoples, but, just somewhat like his mom from Barbados. And then he moved with her and was living in Christiansted, the capital, by his youth years, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And as the story goes, he would access books in the library at the church. He had access to books in the library, and he would devour whatever he could get his hands on. And but he lived in the poorest section of Christiansted. They called it the water gut. It's where all the water flow would come, and pass by. And he lived there, and he went to school, but he never finished high school down there at all. And he winds up leaving in 2000. But a little more background: St. Croix, for those not familiar with it, has a history of some militant struggles. Right? They were the second country or island in the Caribbean to have an enslaved-led emancipation victory after Haiti. And they had a major uprising in 1878, 1879 called Fire Burn. They torched a lot of the plantations and stuff. They were putting forth demands. And the racial makeup, if you will, of St. Croix was roughly 5% European on the top of that society, 80% Black on the bottom of that society, and 15% so-called colored, who were in between. And the 5% on top could not maintain effective social control. And social control is a concept I learned a lot about from Alan also, but they couldn't maintain social control without the help of the free colored. So they extended certain privileges to the colored in St. Croix. And there was an edict of full equality passed between European descended and free colored. And whereas in the U.S. you had the Dred Scott decision, you didn't have anything approaching this. So St. Croix had that history, and Jamaica and Barbados to a degree had somewhat similar histories, because when Harrison grows up, he doesn't know the vicious racial antagonisms that he would soon encounter in the U.S. Marcus Garvey comments similarly. I have this in my book, when growing up in Jamaica, and Claude McKay also growing up in Jamaica. McKay writes, I had heard about the racism in the U.S., but I never dreamed of it being so virulent. So Harrison grows up in St. Croix, but his mom dies in 1899, so he's an orphan. And so then he had a sister, an elder sister, who had come up to New York. And as so often is the case, in those years, the first family member to come to the States was a female, right? And that was the case with Harrison's family. So he followed to his sister, and he lived on West 62nd Street. This is before the IRT subway was completed. The IRT went up to Harlem, but it wasn't completed yet. So this was a major concentration of African-American and Afro-Caribbean residents. About 10, 20 years later, I think Thelonious Monk grows up on the next block or something like this, but he's younger. And Harrison's living there. But shortly after he arrives in 1900, New York City has its fourth major race riot. And it was said that a Black person couldn't walk from 42nd Street to 59th Street without fear of being attacked by a mob, right? It was really, Harrison, this was all new to Harrison. And he, he starts writing. And then there were lynchings. Again, he didn't know lynchings back in St. Croix. And the year he came, there were, I have the total number in my book. I think it was 47 and maybe more, maybe 100. I should know this. But he writes about lynchings, and he starts writing letters, including, he had 12 letters published in the New York Times. Although he's not finished high school, he's going to high school in New York. And but he starts, and between 1904 and 1910, he's writing letters that get published in the New York Times. As a matter of fact, one of his, while he's still in high school, one of the other New York dailies writes an article, "Genius Found in West Indian Student," because Harrison was working 5 days a week and 3 nights, and he still gets citywide honors in a couple subjects. They hadn't seen anybody like this. He was really brilliant. And so he never got a chance to go to college. He always had to work, and he continued on this road until around 1907, 8, 9, and 10. In 1907, a major development. In 1905, 6, and 7, he starts interacting a bit with Arthur Schomburg and Johnny Bruce, because they have a Negro Society for Historical Research. And they also have study groups that meet at St. Benedict the Moor Roman Catholic Church on 53rd Street, and another church on 53rd Street. And in these churches, African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans would come and meet together, discuss items. And you got to understand, there was some tension between the two groups back then, but they would come together and, air their views, sometimes agree, sometimes disagree, but learn how to do that in an open and above board manner and be friends afterwards. It was a great intellectual atmosphere for Harrison, and it's something that influenced him for the rest of his life. He was of that ilk for the rest of his life. He would speak openly and speak his mind, and it wasn't ill-mannered or ill-tempered, if you will. So he's working.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Let me interrupt you before you
Sure.
continue.
Sure.
In some respects, Decipher, the lecture series that we are putting together, represents a resurrection of this tradition of autodidactism, if you will. And I wanted to know if you could elaborate for our audience about the parallel efforts that were part of the community institutions in which African-American radicals of Harrison's generation, including Harrison himself, initially got their introduction to both radical thought and also so-called free thought. Since I've known of your work for some time, I've read your dissertation on Harrison and then the subsequent publications that you put out, his first volume and then the collected writings. And one of the things that I recall is that you discussed his self-education in the Lyceum that were in operation in New York City at the time. And so I wondered, amongst other formations that led to this deep kind of education that you refer to. And I wonder if you could just tell our audience a bit more about those kind of independent efforts towards self-education that Harrison was a part of.
Yeah, well, those lyceums, that was the Lyceums of St. Benedict de Moor and a second church on West 53rd Street. As I said, Schomburg was involved. A Westchester resident, John E. Bruce, was involved. He was a major newspaper editor. Charles and Williana Jones Burroughs, a number of other Black intellectuals and activists. All these people are working class intellectuals because they're messengers, they're clerks, whatever, that's the jobs they hold to pay the bills. And they would meet usually weekly, and they'd have guest speakers. Just a tremendously, a little bit like what you do, and it was very invigorating for all the participants. And that's where Harrison really got his first and early he made his first and early intellectual leap. Prior to that, he had been kind of on his own, writing his letters to the papers and things like that. Then also around this period, around 1907, 1908, Harrison would read intensely, and he read a lot of the literature of the church and the old literature, about the history of the church. And he goes back to the Council of Nicaea and things like this. And he's also working at a place called the White Rose Home. I say working, he's volunteering, White Rose Home for Colored Women. It was a place where Black women from the South or the Caribbean could come, they could board. If they had children could stay there, and they had a kindergarten class for the children and race history classes, which Harrison would teach for free in the evenings. And he did that, and that was headed by a woman named Frances Reynolds Kaiser, an outstanding African-American woman who really needs a major biography written about her. And I go into her in some depth in volume 1. And so he's working with the church lyceums, he's working with the White Rose Home, but he's also reading on his own church history, and he just finds increasingly that he can't accept a lot of what is put forth as the Christian history, right? He doesn't agree with a lot of what's put forth. And so he starts to break from Christianity, essentially, but he breaks from the church. And at this time, Black church is the most powerful institution in the Black community. So this is a major break. And he details this in a letter he writes to Miss Kaiser, Frances Reynolds Kaiser, which is in a Hubert Harrison reader. And it's described also in volume 1 of the biography. And it's a torturous break, because when he breaks from the church, he's breaking from his old past worldview. And that's very, threatening. What does a person do when they make that move? But he proceeds ahead because Harrison always had intellectual courage. And he does that. And then he starts writing and speaking on behalf of free thought for a while. Free thought was thought unfettered, untied down by religious doctrine, and he'd question and challenge things. He does that. And then from there, he moves into the Socialist Party because he starts reading socialist literature. This is around he may have been involved earlier, but it's by 1911 that he really gets involved. And the reason he gets involved around 1911 so much is he gets a job in the post office in 1907, and he works until 1910 in the post office. And I smile when I say that because I did 33 years in the post office. And Theodore W. Allen, the other guy I write about, was a coal miner for quite a number of years, but in later life worked in the bulk mail center where I worked in the postal facility too. So everybody got that post office thing going. And he's working in the post office, and Booker T. Washington, who's the most powerful Black man in America at the time, goes to Europe and makes some statements about things being basically fine back home in the US for Black people. Now, Du Bois, who's the main opponent, if you will, of Booker T in that period, gets together a group of over 50 people, and they sign protest letters and saying this is not right, and blah, blah, blah. And Harrison, who's working in the post office, writes 2 letters to the New York Sun, which is a daily newspaper, and says, essentially, Booker T, you're free to say what you want, but you should tell the truth. And then he lays out what he understands to be the truth of conditions for Black people. And within a very short while, he is summarily fired from the post office. And this is through the efforts of Booker T. Washington, his right-hand assistant, Emmett Scott, and a fellow named Morgan, who's the postmaster of the biggest post office in New York is named after him. It's Morgan Station on 38th Street. And they fire him summarily. He had nothing on his record. I was a postal steward, officer. I know how to get his records. I wrote to St. Louis and he had a clean record, and then all of a sudden he's fired. And this is devastating for a man. Harrison at the time has 2 children, and he and his wife would wind up having 5. And for the remainder of his life, he's always living at the edge of poverty. So
Right.
A little bit, Rob, what you wanted?
Yeah. I feel like I'm hearing feedback. One moment.
I did hear echo. I want to jump in real quick. One of the things that caught my attention, I wanted you to finish though, when you were talking about him writing and getting letters published in the New York Times. This is in the early 1900s.
Yeah.
This is before African Americans can vote and have the right to do many things. I didn't want to just gloss over that without. This is a big achievement. Like this is a really, really big thing.
Yes, it is. And but he says something interesting along those lines. He says, essentially, he says, when you're writing letters to the paper, if they don't know who you are, you have a chance to get some equal treatment, and that's what he did. Although sometimes he identified himself as being Black, or he used the word Negro back then, as did Marcus Garvey, as did a lot of people. So if I use it in some of my speech here, it's in quotes, with a capital N, as it came to be used. But Harrison was a leader in using the word Negro with a capital N, and that's what he used through most of his life. Garvey also used Negro as opposed to colored or other more derogatory terms. But he thought that it was interesting what he said, that you stood a chance of getting some equal treatment.
I was just going to say for our audience that Harrison's dismissal from the post office has to be placed in the context of this larger kind of titanic struggle that was taking place between the conservative forces that were headed by Booker T. Washington, the so-called Wizard of Tuskegee, and more liberal radical forces, including W.E.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, and other radical intellectuals who often were themselves publishers of major newspapers, as Harrison would go on to be. But I wanted to ask some more, because Timor, I know that you have also undertaken study of the life of Arthur Schomburg. As I said before, you have a volume that's available on Amazon. And so you've studied with a greater degree of detail than the ordinary layperson these efforts at self-education. And I was curious to know if you could tell us a little bit about the way that the life of autodidacts like Harrison, like Schomburg, intersected with people who actually relocated to Westchester County, like Johnny Bruce. Can you tell us more?
Well, Bruce Gritt, or Johnny Bruce, also known as Bruce Gritt, who was one of the writers, was actually a mentor of Arthur Schomburg for quite some time. He was 20 years his senior. So when he comes into New York, he actually takes Arthur Schomburg under his wing. And mind you, when you look at the zygotes of the movement of culture, you have to also look at, there were 3 main renaissances that had taken place in the country as it relates to African Americans' advancement. One of the major renaissances is in Washington, D.C. The second one is in Philadelphia, which is a noted actually renaissance in terms of intellectualism and intellectual prowess. And then also the Harlem Renaissance, which is the third and last renaissance in terms of intellectual movement. So when you look at Schomburg and Black bibliophiles and intellectuals, bibliophiles as far as Henry P. Slaughter, who actually worked for government in the government accounting office, or government printing office, and then other colleagues, Jesse Morlang and Spingard, all these particular individuals was a part of this zygotes of collecting data and information in lieu of making sure that they can actually advance African Americans in all over the world. And so they wasn't thinking in terms of blacks just in America. For example, with J. Rogers, Jules Augustus Rogers spoke over 20 languages and was able to decipher information of Africans all over the world. And that's why you have now the 3-volume works of J. Rogers entitled Sex and Race, Volume 1, 2, and 3. And a lot of the works of J. Rogers were actually followed up by Ivan Van Sertima. A lot of these movements did not happen in a formalized setting, if you will, although it was formalized. The American Negro Academy was a group of Black intellectuals who actually came together and wrote papers and actually developed their different positions as it relates to the cultural advancement in the country and abroad. So it wasn't just a concept of this considering America. It was always a pan-African international phenomenon, because the struggle, as far back as if you're looking at 1920, you have to also look at World War I. You also, in this impact in terms of Africa, because the war was really about Africa at the end of the day. And it stemmed from the 1885-1886 Berlin and Brussels Conference, dealing with Congo, so on and so forth. So it was a social complexity. There was a lot of secrecy that had taken place. A lot of things that they had done wasn't always public. Bruce Britt was very stern, and even if it came down to physically fighting, if need be, to make sure that you understood their position.
Right. So I wanted to ask, we've alluded to the intersection between international developments that took place at the beginning of the 20th century and culminated in World War I, and also a period of domestic turbulence that Harrison becomes a leader in, that's known as today as the New Negro Movement. And for many of our listeners, they're probably not going to be all that familiar with the terminology. They may have, in fact, heard of the Harlem Renaissance, one of the major studies of which was done by Nathan Huggins, which you mentioned earlier, Jeff. But I was wondering if you guys could make the connection between the kind of turbulence that was set off as a result of World War I, both internationally and here at home, in terms of race relations and also labor struggles, and how that contributes to Harrison's eventual emergence as one of the leading voices of Black radical thought and organizing.
You had major lynchings all over the country. You had the Tulsa, Oklahoma bombing. You had so many different, a plethora of events and ongoing putting the foots in African Americans and Caribbeans' necks throughout the whole entire country, where we were disenfranchised. To have a bombing as far back as 1921 with Tulsa, Oklahoma, and to have been disenfranchised of your property and your resources, where the people that actually were in the community were stakeholders in the community. That's just not one event. You're talking about Rosewood. There were many different events, and then the ongoing lynching. I mean, we have modern day lynchings dealing with the police brutality and what have you. So that same fight that we have today is not something that's brand new. It's very antiquated as far back as even before 1492. So it's the zygotes come from the conditionality of economic and political disenfranchisement, in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong.
Right. Go on, Jeff.
Yeah, a couple things. Harrison, like Du Bois and like William Monroe Trotter, was very critical of Booker T. Washington. But Harrison was also critical of the NAACP. And that's one of the breaks that he makes. He talks about when the NAACP was founded, and he quotes from some of the reporting on that event and how they kind of took out certain things that happened there because they didn't want to alienate potential white support, you know. And he thought that was no way to go, because he says you can't have an organization functioning with based on white people's expectations of how black people should act. You know, black people had to have more autonomy with their organizations. But he also was critical of the NAACP for the leadership it was giving. He didn't think it was militant enough or precise enough. They didn't, particularly around the time of World War I, some of the major issues were when Woodrow Wilson led the U.S. into World War I, he said it was to make the world safe for democracy. This is the kind of stuff we still hear these days, right? And that's what he proclaimed. But Harrison founds his Liberty League at the exact same time. And he says, their slogan is, let's make the South safe for democracy. And he writes, I didn't believe this guy one bit, you know, essentially is what he's saying. I didn't believe him at all. He goes, Wilson had no, and if people know Wilson's past and his history, I mean, he was a segregation, you know, he had a bad history on race issues. So Harrison was very critical of that position. But after the U.S. goes into the war, the NAACP, which didn't have black national leaders at that time, the major leader was AJ Spingarn, right? Who was a European American who taught at Columbia. And he was the closest white friend of Du Bois by Du Bois's own admission. And Spingarn, when Harrison and William Monroe Trotter tried to convene a protest meeting, which is on the front cover of the first volume, that's where Harrison's sitting with his arms crossed like that. Next to him in the full picture is William Monroe Trotter. It's a meeting in June of 1918, where they had men and women, black men and women from 35 states come together to put forth demands for enforcement of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment and anti-lynching legislation. These were demands the NAACP didn't want to make because they didn't want to alienate their white support. And Spingarn, as the head of the NAACP, he wouldn't even try and change Harrison's mind, but he tried to reach out to Trotter, but Trotter wouldn't do it. So he wound up convening another meeting to try and steal the thunder from that Liberty Congress. But he also spoke to Du Bois about what he was doing. And after the discussion with Du Bois, on his own account, but how much he was influenced by Spingarn will still have to be written. But he writes the editorial that he's most embarrassed about in his entire life. It is called Close Ranks. It's only one paragraph long. And he writes, while this war lasts, let us forget our special grievances and close ranks behind the war effort. Everybody knew what the special grievances were: lynching, segregation, disfranchisement, right? And Harrison nailed him on it in one of his next issues of The Voice. Du Bois would never speak to Harrison, essentially, again. You know, this is how Harrison would sometimes sting people, by speaking straightforward and directly. Although some years later, Herbert Aptheker, who pulled together Du Bois's papers for publication, said that 30 or 40 years after this, Du Bois acknowledged the correctness of the criticism of his opponents in that period. But he didn't do it when Harrison was alive at all. But so, and Harrison understood, and as I think Timor, someone mentioned, Rob, you might have, Africa was one of the, Harrison writes how Africa was one of the main stakes in this whole struggle. And Harrison writes some wonderful pieces, particularly in the early 20s, on what was really at stake. And you could see what was at stake when they tried to settle the terms of the peace and how they were going to divide things up, etc. So Harrison is so wide-ranging. He writes on domestic issues, international issues, but he's not an easy read. I want to say, you know, I wrote these books, and these are big books. These are very big books, but I felt a certain responsibility to get Harrison's life out there for current and future generations, so people like you folks could, you know, draw from him and take him to new and higher levels. I mean, he's got so much to offer, you know. And again, I just want to thank you for doing this today. This is just wonderful.
Well, I have to say on a personal Jeff, that your biography of Harrison actually served as a direct inspiration for this larger project of which Decipher is a part. There are numerous ways that it influenced me, but one such way that I drew on after reading your work was the adoption of the tricolor, the black, brown, and yellow.
Very deep.
Which is a part of the FIST logo. I'm not going to show it to anyone. I can't find it, but if you see the FIST logo, in fact, that's where I got the idea from after reading the first volume of your biography of Harrison. And that leads me to ask you to elaborate a bit more about Harrison's eventual influence as one of Garvey's chief lieutenants, as part of the Garvey movement, when Marcus Garvey comes to the United States in the opening decades of the 20th century and eventually starts the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. I don't remember the rest. If brother Jeff Monroe is listening, I know he's going to tell me.
I mean, can I ask you a question though, to Dr. Perry? As far as what I understand, when Marcus Garvey came into Harlem, Hubert Harrison introduces him to Harlem,
to his first major crowd. Yes, yeah, and he joins Harrison's organization. Garvey joins Harrison's organization, and then Harrison was holding weekly meetings, and Garvey started holding meetings down the hall. And after Harrison finished his meeting, he had encouraged people to go down. Harrison was very, you know, sharing and giving, but that same reciprocity didn't come, you know, after a short while. But one thing before I get into answering Rob's question, just so the listeners know, the black, brown, and yellow, the flag, the tricolor flag that Harrison's Liberty League had, he said, that's because that's the colors we are domestically and internationally. And he also comments that from that tricolor, Garvey switched to the red, black, and green, which people know today as Black Liberation colors. But Harrison offers some comments on that, which I'll leave for the readers to go see what Harrison says about that. But so Garvey's following Harrison, and Harrison's, his voice is coming out for a while, but Harrison is always kind of independent. And one thing I learned in writing, particularly the second volume of the Harrison biography, with a lot of the leading black activists of the period, it's important to follow the money. See where they're getting their money from or how they're getting their money, because that helps explain a lot of other things. And without going into it too much here, Harrison was offered, I like that fist, by the way. Harrison was offered $10,000 by a white supporter, which he refused. That's a tremendous sum of money in that time, 1917 and 18, because he wanted to maintain his political independence, and he explained that. But after, by 1919, his voice it's no longer functioning very much. Harrison tried to take the voice down south, which was the heart of the African American community. He went to D.C., spoke a bunch down there, and then he took it to Virginia, and that was part of a plan to go even further south. But he got sick, he wore himself out, he ran out of money. You know, he's always at the edge of poverty. So he came back, but he's speaking all these times and he's developing a bigger following. And he's back, and in 1919, he's doing what he can to pay bills. And Garvey, in the last week of 1919, approaches him. And Garvey initially approaches him and says he'd like Harrison to head a college that Garvey would like to start. But really, Garvey wants him to become the editor of the Negro World because Harrison's the best newspaper person around, right? And Harrison, you know, after checking out how things were, accepts, and he goes in, and within a short time, he effectively becomes the managing editor, although he's not listed as such. And in the book, in volume 2, Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 1927, in that book, Harrison lays out in some detail all the changes he made in the paper. Let me say one more thing. When I met Harrison's daughter, Ada, the one who lived in New Rochelle, after I finished my orals for my dissertation, we went out to a restaurant in Manhattan, B. Smith's restaurant. I don't know if people have been there ever. You know, I was taking her out to dinner. She was 75 at the time, and we were going to celebrate. I passed my orals. And at the end of the meal, she reaches into her bag and she goes, "Here, Jeff." And she gives me, oh, I didn't know what it was at first. She gives me Hubert Harrison's diary. I couldn't believe it. I had written 800 pages on the guy. I didn't know he had a diary. And once I got that, I knew I had a 2-volume biography. And the diary is extraordinary because Harrison writes clearly, but he's honest. And he says, look, I'm going to put down things the way they happen. I'm not going to try and embellish. I realize some things I write are going to loom large later on. Other things are going to recede in importance. And that diary is over 200 pages, and it's part of over 1,300 pages of documents that are now freely available online at Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library. When after Ada died, his son, Charles Richardson, who was very good, he passed away a couple of years ago, was very good friends with Whitney Payne. AJ, do you know her? He's one of your friends. Whitney Payne, do you know the woman? She's one of your Facebook friends. Yeah, yes, she and Charles were very good friends. And Charles, you know, just says, well, at a certain point, he says, let's place these papers up at Columbia. We talked to Schomburg. We talked to all these places. The family decided on Columbia. They got all the money. I was not in it. I'm not a ripoff or anything like that. But part of the agreement was they would digitize. You know, we had a little foresight on this. Look ahead. And so over 1,300 items are available online. So the listeners can go to Columbia University's Rare Book and Manuscript Library digital collection, and they can see all these documents from Harrison in his own writing, including his diary. Now, I'm taking that to come back to the question about Garvey. So in that diary, he writes some of the most revealing comments about his relationship with Garvey. Early, he writes about how he reshapes the Negro world, how he starts pulling all the columns together, you know, shortens the headlines from 2, 3, 4 lines, you know, to one line, how he asks, you know, he has people identify themselves when they're writing articles, how he starts book reviews, West Indian news notes, poetry for the people, all these fascinating new, he gets people to write, artists, you know, prominent artists and intellectuals. Johnny Bruce, he gets to start writing for Garvey's paper. And that's a fascinating chapter in the history of Black journalism. And but then Harrison also later on starts sensing differences he has with Garvey, and he documents them. And that's very insightful and revealing, and it will, you know, cause people to think a little bit about, both Harrison and about Garvey, and a lot of it's got to do with the handling of money, treatment of people, things like that. But there's much more to it than that. And I encourage people to read it and, judge on their own. And then later on, he becomes pretty convinced that Garvey's really mishandling money, as do a lot of other people. And that's when Garvey gets brought up on charges. And people who are involved in bringing him up on charges include W.E.B. Du Bois, Cyril Briggs, a host of other people, W.A. Domingo, a lot of the radicals. So there's much new information on Garvey in Harrison Volume 2 also. And Harrison, it should be noted also, he was very good friends with a woman named Augusta Savage, who was a sculptress, leading Black sculptress in the mid-20s. Great talent, and she won a competition to go to Europe, didn't have the funds. Harrison tried to help her raise funds. But he also is friends of sorts with Garvey's first wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey. And he and she work on a biography of Marcus Garvey, The Rise and Fall of Marcus Garvey. And there are 4 different versions of this. And that's talked about in the book a little bit, although I still haven't gotten my hands on the final copy, as much as there was a final copy of it. But I haven't given up hope. One other thing, just to mention for good researchers like we have here, Harrison, besides speaking on street corners all the time, spoke on street corners and writing for all these publications. I located over 700 articles he wrote in his short life, 700. He also spoke on radio 3 times on shows that were recorded. And they were recorded, and I think the archives were sent out to the Edison archives in New Jersey, but they're largely uninventoried. But good librarians might be able to do a little better than I've been able to do so far, and they might be able to come up with them. And that would be wonderful, because after 40 years research, I still haven't heard Harrison's voice, although by all accounts he was a great orator and speaker. And I haven't seen him speaking, although a friend from the Virgin Islands says he's seen a 15-minute snippet of a video of Harrison speaking on a street corner, but he can't remember where he saw it. So that's little projects for everybody.
I wanted to add a background note by pointing out that so-called New Negro Movement, of which Harrison is such a vital figure, stems from a kind of reconceptualization of the Black personality, and in particular African-American manhood, as we see an increase in the number of lynchings in the United States in the post-Reconstruction period, and the rejection of, and this has relevance to today, the rejection of the model of Black manhood that had essentially been passed down and popularized amongst African Americans in the form of Uncle Tom, from Harriet Ward Beecher Stowe's abolitionist novel. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, Uncle Tom was a regular feature on the American stage. This was a time in American cultural history when live theater production is one of the main forms of leisure entertainment. And Uncle Tom came to represent the prototype for African-American manhood, and then took on very submissive kind of deferential overtones. And in many respects, Harrison and others are part of a movement who seek to repudiate this particular notion of submissive masculinity that had been especially held up high by the Black middle class, that in many respects was shy to engage in a direct confrontation with whites when they used armed violence against African Americans. And this rejection of this sort of outdated notion of Black masculinity was really quickened by the Black experience in World War II, when, despite the opposition of the white establishment here in the United States, and especially the forces of white supremacy in the South, African Americans eventually took up arms for the nation on the battlefields of Europe. And upon their return home, were greeted with not just mere disdain for breaking the notions of white supremacy that a Black man couldn't serve in uniform, but were also subject to a number of violent attacks. The New Negro Movement emerges during the so-called Red Summers of 1919, when you have continuing race riots, massacres all across the United States. I don't recall what the numbers are, but we're talking about in the hundreds of persons, African-American persons, who are killed as a result of these kind of race massacres. And so Harrison is part of the group of Black radicals who call for armed self-defense. One of the first open calls for armed self-defense that especially make it into the American public during this period. And so that's important because, in fact, if people are familiar with the New Negro Movement at all, it's usually in terms of the context of the Harlem Renaissance, and it's really understood to be a cultural movement. But in fact, when you go back and study African-American political history in the opening decades of the 20th century and the role of Harrison, you come to appreciate that it's not merely a cultural movement, although certainly Harrison is a big proponent of a kind of cultural reimagining of Black life and our role in American society and global society. But just as importantly, it's a political movement. And I wanted to know if you could maybe elaborate more on not just the cultural dimension, but the political dimension of Harrison's work and how it not represents just a break with the NAACP, but also maybe even with socialist communist doctrine that prevails in the U.S. during this time.
Excellent, Rob. Excellent. Yes, Harrison, he referred to it oftentimes as the militant New Negro Movement. You know, he would use that phrase. And it was an eye for an eye. You know, he would, if they're going to attack us, we're going to fight back. We're not going to take it idly. He preached armed self-defense. In 1918, when East St. Louis erupted in late June, early July of 1918, Harrison called a rally on 132nd Street, I think, in Harlem. 2,000 people attended to protest because East St. Louis came under attack, the whole African-American community. And why that's interesting is 100 and some odd years later, in Ferguson, which is about 10 or 12 miles away, you had an incident that led to mass protests all over, you know, in African-American communities. But Harrison had done that, you know, much earlier. But Harrison was very clear from the beginning. He was not going to stand by idly and take this. He was advocating fighting back with arms. He went to D.C. before that summer, that hot summer of 1919, and he, some of the accounts, and I document them in volume 2, saying Harrison was really the most militant of all the speakers that had come to Washington in that period, you know, and people were taking leads from him and how to respond. There was no question where Harrison stood on that. On Tulsa, which Timor mentioned, Harrison wrote right away on Tulsa and criticized that and said, no, we're not going to tolerate this. And even in a year or two after this stuff, in 1923, and I say this only because today I was out in Jersey, West Jersey, seeing my daughter, and I rode past a place called Garrett Mountain in New Jersey. And that is where the KKK came and burned a cross in 22 or 23, you know, to announce their arrival up north in Jersey. And Harrison went out to Patterson and challenged the Klan openly, you know, to come on, get it on here, let's go. And he did that in a couple of events. He was very militant, and there were other times where he would just, on a more individual level, when he was speaking on the street corners at 181st Street up near off Amsterdam Avenue, where the subway comes up. I can't remember the street right now, getting old. And he was giving a talk, and he got surrounded by a mob of whites. And they started attacking him, and he takes the table leg and defends himself from people. So he would fight back individually. He'd advocate group fighting back. He'd advocate armed struggle. So his was a militant new Negro movement. He referred to it that way repeatedly. But the point you make also is Harrison's new Negro movement was both political and literary. And this is where it's distinguished very much from the movement associated with Alain Leroy Locke, which is primarily a literary movement. And that's the one that gets, or had been getting, quite a bit of play, if you will, in the academy. For instance, when Henry Louis Gates writes The Trope of the New Negro, you know, that's the article that led to his rise academically, doesn't mention Harrison. When he puts out his book on the New Negro, which is the canonical text, again, if you will, he's got a number of Harrison articles, but they're misstated, and you know, Harrison loses his primacy, and he says things like Harrison got militant during World War I because of he was an advocate and a follower of Du Bois when Harrison was the main critic of Du Bois. You know, so Harrison's role in all this was long diminished historically. But it's changing now, again, through the efforts of folks like you and many others who are seeking to find the truth and get it out there. But he was very militant politically and culturally.
Timor, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Now, I think that one of the things that's very important that we all need to know, when I met Dr. Perry years ago, and to now have the materials properly archived at the Columbia University setting is beyond measure. Because not only have he had taken the leadership and developing 2 extensive volumes written about the biography and the political history of Harrison, but he also went as far as making sure that it's properly housed and archived, and even managed that aspect to make sure that payment went out from the deed of gift agreement to the necessary people that needed to have that payment. There was no impropriety or anything of any sort. That's something that's going to make sure that his efforts will make sure that Harrison, or as John G. Johnson would say, Dr. Harrison. John G. Johnson would actually call him Dr. Harrison. He was one of his students during that particular time, and he would speak highly of him. He's making sure that there would be no anachronism of the history of the Harlem Renaissance or the intellectual movements nationally and internationally as it relates to Harrison, because Harrison is an integral part. In many regards, he perhaps is the epicenter of social movements as it relates to Black struggle in America and abroad.
AJ, did you want to add anything, brother?
No, I'm sitting here doing multiple things. We are now, as of now, we're streaming on our YouTube channel, Black Westchester on YouTube channel, and also the LinkedIn page. So I'm actually going back and forth through all the pages, promoting the show and trying to get more people into the conversation and checking comments and stuff. So I'm learning a lot myself. Sometimes I get accused of talking a lot, and you can't learn if you're not listening. So I am listening and enjoying the conversation.
Well, I mean, one of the things I hope that comes out of this conversation, for you in particular, AJ, and for all of Black Westchester patrons, is a greater appreciation of the central role that newspaper editors have played in the Black freedom struggle over the course of generations, and independent alternative news owners. As a matter of fact, I'm finishing up a book-length study of Black journalism, and one of the main theses, I don't recall the author's name right now or the title, and I too am getting old, but one of the main theses that the author makes is that it is because of the alternative press that presents the authentic voice of Black people and provides for the disclosure of facts that often remain hidden from the pages of the major dailies, that in fact the Black struggle is able to be pressed both domestically and also internationally. And so and one of the things that was made in this particular book that I'm reading, I think it's Race News, I think is the title, I'm not sure, it's slipping my mind, is that at the very time that the Liberty League met in DC in about, what is it, 1917, 1918, there was
Liberty Congress, yeah.
Yeah, the Liberty Congress. At the same time, there was a meeting that had been convened of Black newspaper writers, more mainstream newspaper writers, by the federal government, who essentially had sought to co-opt the kind of militant anti-imperialist line that had been adopted by figures like Harrison, who opposed America's involvement in these wars precisely because of the fear that it would lead to a continuation of the kind of colonial domination, which was at the very root, as Timor pointed out, was at the very root of World War I.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
And I would say that when we look at, when you examine war and the strategic initiatives that's taken to actually subdue, subvert, or actually control, one of the things is gathering intelligence, counterintelligence, and what have you. And we can't minimize the efforts of the intelligence communities, not just here, but all over the country, to weaken efforts of people like Hubert Henry Harrison and many others who actually collaborated and or worked with government to make sure that efforts is not brought forward to advance people of African descent. It's a very we have to take that into account, because there were Black intellectuals that were actually working with state government and federal government to bring Black folks down. That's a reality of the situation, through entrapment, counterintelligence, and what have you. So that's a major effort that have been taking place and continues to take place through propaganda, through military might, physical force, and otherwise.
I just want to add, I know Jeffrey wants to get in. I just wanted to add, I mean, that's one of the difficulties of having African American media source, funding. So where do you get your funding from? So you know, if the government is funding you, you can't. A lot of people are not going to criticize the very government that is funding them because they fear for losing their funding. You understand what I'm saying? So you have to find other ways of surviving. And I'm sure from my minimal research that I've done on the traditional African American newspapers of the different eras was dealing with that, finding independent funding sources. So we try advertising and our supporters and stuff. And I think it's very important even today, you know, that when we as a people have something like this, we need to make sure that we support it so that we will continue to have it. People tell you that is very important, but they support you with words and not their wallets. And then once you're not there no more, they be like, oh, we missed that. We need more of that, but you didn't support it when it was there. And I see that this is nothing new. That's what we're dealing with, but this is what traditionally has been a problem with having, you know, black voices like that, you know, stand out, you know. So yeah. I just wanted to add that. I don't know if that fits in with what you said.
I mean, it fits in. I think what happens is you have a fight on different levels. You have a fight in terms of the cultural hegemony. Edmund Burke says this: the business of the state is to maintain status quo. That's his job. So it's not just the state government or federal government that's interested in that. You have financial capitalists that work on their behalf to also engage in subterfuge as well. And so sometimes funding may come, to a particular outfit, but it's funding based on the agenda that the cultural hegemony wants you to produce. And if you're not producing in that particular way, then you're not getting funded.
And I just want to add and then pass it to Jeffrey. I've often said freedom is not free. We've turned down, many people don't know, we've turned down money from different people because it was a means to, money we could desperately need and use, but it was a means to silence the strongest critic and you know what I'm saying? And get us to write and carry their propaganda. And my partner Damon has actually torn up a big check in front of somebody that we were very critical of, you know what I mean? Like tore it up right there in their face. And we've turned down or not been able to been denied certain funds because of certain being critical of certain government officials and you know, just keeping it real basically, for lack of a better word. But go ahead, Jeff. I just saw Jeff with his finger up a few times.
Well, I appreciate these wonderful comments. I wanted to get back to what Dr. Bob said. First, Harrison was one of the very first Black activists to be monitored by the Bureau of Investigation, later the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I document a lot of their, how they tried to monitor him, report on him, intervene in what he was doing. Number two, when you spoke about the Liberty Congress, another person who was involved very centrally in that was Spingarn, who I mentioned earlier, the head of the NAACP. But Spingarn, and most people don't know this, was a major in military intelligence. Hear what I'm saying? A major in military intelligence. That's that branch of the government that monitored the Black and the radical community. And to this day, the NAACP gives their award for outstanding achievement by a Black American. It's called the Spingarn Medal in his name. He was also the closest white friend of Du Bois. And when Du Bois wrote that editorial on closed ranks, the one I mentioned, I quoted from before, it was while he was putting in an application for a captaincy in military intelligence. Again, military intelligence, the branch of the government that monitored the Black and the radical community. People should know this history, got to think about things like this. Just one other slightly related thing, because I think it may have a Westchester tie, is Ray Richardson's brother. I knew Ray Richardson, his brother. I knew Charles Richardson, but Charles's brother, Ray, died early in 71. I think they grew up, the whole family grew up in New Rochelle, after, because his mother was separated from her husband. But I'll make the story very short. But he was in film school at Boston University when MLK was assassinated. And the public station up there, the public TV station, had no Black programming at all. And they started looking, what are we going to do about this? So they went into the film program at Boston University and they pulled out Ray Richardson and the father of, this is where my memory goes again, for Love and Basketball, who's the female star.
Sanaa Lathan.
Sanaa Lathan.
Yeah, Sanaa Lathan.
Yeah.
Sanaa Lathan.
What's her dad's name? Stan Lathan, I think.
Stan Lathan, yes.
Yeah, a great filmmaker. And he and Ray Richardson were very good friends. And they started a show up there called Say Brother, which preceded even Gil Noble's show in New York, like it is. And it was a great show. But then when New Bedford, Mass erupted in 1970, in late 1970, they did what was unheard of. For 6 days, they took their cameras into the community and spoke to the people and let the people speak. It wasn't talking heads. And all of a sudden, a cascade of voices came down. You got to get this guy off the air and everything. So Ray Richardson got fired. The show got taken off the air. Eventually, the show came back. But then he goes down to Mexico to visit his father, who was a Tuskegee airman. But when he returned to the U.S., after World War II. He didn't want to deal with the racism here. He went down to Mexico. It's all told. I wrote an article for Black Agenda Report, Black Star News. I encourage people to read it on Ray Richardson because it's an eye-opener. And he dies under mysterious conditions in Mexico while he's down there shortly after visiting his father. And on the same day that he dies, allegedly from swimming, the former president of Guatemala, who the U.S. ousted in an open coup in 1954, also dies allegedly from drowning in his in Mexico in his own bathtub. In that case, I mean, this is the period when they were offing Black leaders and other leaders around the world. So always keep an eye open for that stuff. I know you folks do, but
that's another thing too. Shows like ours don't usually get major broadcasting because of the honesty of the show. We're stuck with doing the way we're doing it now and getting it out the way we're getting it out, and hopefully, a lot of people watch it after the fact, and some people watch it on the website and the archives. Hopefully, the information. There's always that tightrope you're walking. You want more people to engage, but you're not going to get the broadcasting push behind a show like this most of the time. Like there's a saying that I always post: people want you to keep it real until you keep it real and say something that they don't like. So that's the tightrope. Again, my quote: "Freedom is not free." We try our best. I know this is not about us, but we try our best to try to carry on the tradition of the African American papers of the past. I stand on that, and but trying to find a way to do it and reach more people is always that tightrope that Black Westchester walks.
Well, we've only got about we're coming to the close of the show shortly, and there's one final theme, at least, that I want you to speak to that has relevance to contemporary debates that we're now having in the African American community and beyond. Specifically, that is the vision of liberation represented in the socialist movement and doctrine. It's important for us to note that one of the ways in which Hubert Harrison represents a break with conventional Black thought of his time is his rejection of Black capitalism as it is being propounded by Booker T. Washington. Everyone should know that essentially what Booker T. Washington's program calls for is represented in his 1895 Atlanta Exposition free speech, otherwise known as the Atlanta Compromise, is for African Americans to shelve any kind of program of militant struggle and instead find ways to integrate into the American economy, even on terms in subordinate position. And Harrison is part of that group of African American thinkers who rejects American capitalism as a model, or we're going to say global capitalism, as a model for economic development of all peoples, but especially subordinate peoples. So I wanted to know if you could say, firstly, why, a little bit more, why he rejects capitalism per se, because I think we need to be reminded of this today as a new generation of African American influentials also touts the wonders of capitalism as a way of individual liberation, but often at the cost of downplaying and glossing over the real problems that the masses of our people continue to confront. Richard Wright, in his work, 12 million Black Voices, I think, he says that the African American person who enjoys economic success is like, and here I just paraphrase, is like that one fish that managed to breach from the school of fish that remains submerged below the surface of the water. In other words, they are the exception and not the rule. And we should never fail to remember that. And so I wanted you, Jeff, to tell us, why was Harrison such a critic of capitalism, and maybe also to close out how his particular doctrine represented a break from also the mainline view of socialists, that if we just simply have a proletarian revolution, that, you know what, all things will take care of itself and white supremacy will be destroyed, as a consequence.
Very good. Very good. Harrison was of the working class. He was utterly of the working class. He lived in poverty virtually all his life. He knew it firsthand. He lived amongst the people. He lived when he's in Harlem, he's on 134th Street, at that time, the most densely populated street in Harlem. He saw it every day. He lived it. It was in his bones. And he saw the great inequality in society, and he was opposed to it. That was part of the appeal of the socialist movement, because they said they were about changing that. And when Harrison went to the socialists, he poured his heart out. He spoke many as 23 times a week for them. He campaigned vigorously for Eugene Debs. He put forth major things for the socialists to point the way forward. He said, politically, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea. And for those people not familiar with the touchstone concept, here it is. This is a touchstone. All eyes on this. Touchstone is a black stone. You rub the metal against it to see if it's really the gold it purports to be. It's a great metaphor. Any issue in society, housing, educate, how are black people faring, and what are we going to do about it? Harrison was very clear about that. And so he said that was the key. Black people were the key to revolutionary change. He understood that, and he pushed it. And he wrote the first major theoretical pieces amongst the socialists. He wrote pieces like Southernism or Socialism, what's going to be the direction of this party? But Socialist Party did not respond in the way he hoped, because there were a number of incidents where they chose staying with the white race as opposed to the more thoroughgoing ideals of socialism. So he left the Socialist Party. But he didn't leave those ideas of what socialism could be, or a more egalitarian society good for poor and working people. And later on, when he founds that new Negro movement, and he starts trying to build it, he offers a vision of what he's trying to do. And one of the important things he talks about is building that movement from the bottom up. This is a theme he uses a lot in 1917, later his last organization. His last organization is the International Colored Unity League. You can almost think of Malcolm with the Organization of Afro-American, in the conceptualization. But Harrison is pushing unity from the bottom up. This is not the talented 10th leading the effort, right? And he says we're building this movement from the bottom up because these are the true and tested people we can count on. And but then he also offers some words of insight to the European Americans in the labor movement or in the communist or socialist movement. He goes, if you start working at and making clear the centrality of this struggle against white supremacy and make some gains in that area, we'll certainly be willing to work with you in all kinds of ways. But that's your task. You've got to do that. So Harrison kind of understood what was necessary. I think he felt it in his bones about working people, poor people, the African American community, all the oppression it faces. He knew what had to be done. The direction had to be taken. The struggle had to be, kind of a class-based struggle, but against white supremacy, unrelentingly against white supremacy. And until he died, that was more or less what he was advocating. And that's why I think he has so much to offer. Another reason he has so much to offer, I think, today.
As we come close to the end of the show, I wanted to give Jeff an opportunity to tell everybody where they can purchase his books. If there's a website where people can find out more about you and the work that you're doing. And I wanted Bob and Brother Timor to talk more about the the event coming up at the library where people can find out more about, Harrison. So go ahead.
I have a webpage, www.jeffreybperry.net. No period in there, but you can see my name right there, jeffreybperry.net. It talks about me. I mean, it says who I am, but it's got all kinds of audios and videos and articles, virtually everything for free on Harrison, on Allen, and even on some of the postal struggles, the postal strike, and things like that. I think people will find it so much to offer. I've been working on it for many years, and it's up there for free. You'll find the links for the Harrison papers that are online, his diary, things like that. But also the main volumes, the 2 volumes of the Harrison biography can be got from Columbia University Press. And if you go to Columbia University Press's, right here comes the image up, their webpage. If you go down to purchase, you can get them at 20% off if you use the code CUP20. That stands for Columbia University Press 20. And I really recommend people take advantage of that. I'm also very happy to let you know that the first book I did on Harrison is called The Hubert Harrison Reader. I think we mentioned it earlier. And that is now finally come out in ebook. Because when I first came out, they weren't doing ebooks so much in 2001. And that's from Wesleyan University Press in Connecticut. And so, again, but all these links are available on my webpage, www.jeffreybperry.net. And thanks for giving me an opportunity to,
.net. I wrote .com. Let me correct that.
No, this is not a .com operation. It's a .net.
And can y'all tell everybody about the upcoming event that you will be speaking at the library as part of a series? Bob and Timor, would you like to elaborate on that a little bit so people can come out and
August 26th, Thursday, August 26th at 6:00 p.m. We ask that people come to the library, and we have the lecture series, the Decipher lecture series, which is a partnership between Decipher and also the Mount Vernon Public Library and Black Westchester. This is the kickoff. Also, I want to remind the Mount Vernon community, also Westchester County, that our library, which is the Central Library of Westchester County, is celebrating its 125th anniversary of the library's existence. And so this is one of the programs that we're going to actually develop, and many more programs this year, to be able to continue to educate the community, enhance our patron coming inside of the library. We're reopening back up. We're opening for limited hours. I mean, we have a soft opening now. We have we open from 10 to 6 Tuesdays and Thursdays, 10 to 6, 10 to 8 Tuesdays and Thursdays, 10 to 6 Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and 10 to 1. 9 to 1 on Saturdays due to the summer hours. We're looking to open up fully around the Memorial Day celebration. The Labor Day celebration, so that people can have full access to our library. And we look forward to continue to do these type of cultural programs, books signings, readings, children's programs, because we serve the Westchester County community. Thank you very much.
Great, Tim. Do you have that shirt that you were showing before? Where's that shirt?
Oh, yeah. The shirt. Hold on one sec.
Sorry.
So while Timor gets that, I want to say that I hope this upcoming lecture series speaks to the importance of historical study, because it's really as a result of the studies that I engaged in by reading texts by pioneering scholars like Jeff Perry and so many others who have dedicated their life and time trying to uncover the often unknown history of radical thinkers like Hubert Harrison and so many others. And we really invite the larger community to come out and participate. We anticipate, I know that Jeff is going to have a much more detailed presentation that focuses especially on the latter part of Harrison's life, where he undertakes an enormous variety of activities in an effort to advance the Black freedom struggle. And he offers us, his life offers us important lessons that we need to draw on, some of which we've alluded to here this evening. And so in that regard, everyone, we're really looking forward to everyone coming out and participating. And I really do want to say, giving a special thanks to Timor for, helping to develop this program. Let me say that the inspiration for the program, in part, is not just history, but also a recognition that there has been a tremendous decline in the Black public sphere since the height of the struggles during the 20th century. I was doing some research in the 20th century in the city of Mount Vernon. You had over 5 newspapers that were in operation, the best known of which was Ben Anderson's Observer, but several others that existed prior to. And if we want to look for reasons why we are finding that our needs as a community are going unmet, one of the places to start is the diminution of those institutions. Black Westchester represents an effort to try to revive that tradition of intellectual struggle, self-reporting, and the partnership that we form with the library under Timor Director Davis's leadership is an elevation of that. And so, but we can't do this without y'all. This is not for us. We can only, and you want me to tell you what, this effort, to the extent that it succeeds, represents a collective effort. And if we're going to be able to deepen and expand the struggle and really begin to address the needs of our people, then we all need to participate. So I invite everyone to, follow the lessons of the figures that we talked about today and come out and join us.
Just wanted to make one quick, here's the shirt, the t-shirt right here. Here's a t-shirt for you.
Absolutely.
Hubert Harrison, the father of Harlem Radicalism. Just another announcement in regard to the library. We have every Wednesday a free produce given. We give food out to the public. A bag of food, vegetables, what have you, rice, things like that. We've been doing throughout the summer. We gave out maybe perhaps 1,200 bags of food within the last 2 months, 8 weeks. Also, we have a free lunch program and breakfast program at our library that would end this Thursday on August 20th. We also have several different things that we're doing for the library to make sure that people stay afloat. We have a free ERAC program, which is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. You can call the number 211, which is actually co-sponsored by the city of Mount Vernon and also by United Way. So people who need rental assistance, tenants that need rental assistance, you can actually call 211 and schedule a date to come into our library to make sure that you get the proper rental assistance, which is actually something that's done in relationship to the city and the federal government to help people who are in need of rental assistance. Thank you very much.
Let me add, I'm sorry, one moment, please. Let me just add that for anyone who purchases any of the Harrison books that Jeff has published, he'd be more than happy to sign them following his presentation. And in addition, if I'm not mistaken, Timor's and Jeff are going to work out something to make the shirts available, the Harrison shirt available to anyone who is interested in purchasing. So, there are ways that you can actually own the stuff personally and add it to your collection.
I am not only a librarian, I'm also a music artist.
I was going to ask, where can I get one of those shirts? Because I wanted to buy one of them support. So that answers that question. And I wanted to shout the Mount Vernon Public Library is the first library to archive Black Westchester. So all editions of Black Westchester are currently and will always be available at the library. And also we're working with them to I'm giving them the digital file so that it will be on the website, available on the website. I think it's important is, we go back and read. I found newspapers from 1932. You know what I'm saying, that are not around anymore. So long after Black Westchester is there, as long as there's a library, you will always be able to find it archived at the Mount Vernon Public Library, which is good, and I, great for the legacy as well. So I just wanted to shout that out. We're working with the other libraries to work on getting archived as well. Speaking about libraries, you can also now find the paper at the New Rochelle Public Library, who starts carrying it right now. And I think Bob dropped it off at the Croton Library in Yonkers. It's always been at the Riverfront Library. We're expanding, and in Greenberg Library, we're expanding our exposure. Where you can get the paper every month. Where you can get it every month at the libraries too. What were you saying? I'm sorry.
You should also we should have a conversation with the Schaumburg.
I would definitely welcome that. I definitely would like to do that as well. Especially for archiving and the whole nine, and that would be very important, to as well. Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. A lot of people have just tuned in for the first time. Just if you did, this is Black Westchester presents the People Before Politics radio show. We're on every Sunday between 6 and 8. We stream live on Facebook, on the Black Westchester YouTube channel, and on the Black Westchester LinkedIn page. And all the shows are archived on blackwestchester.com. Just click the radio tab. You'll see People Before Politics. This is show 312. Most of the 312 shows are there, and you can go back and watch them. Again, thank you, everybody, for tuning in, especially those for the first time. We are also celebrating our 7-year anniversary. This is the 7-year anniversary of the show. We definitely could not have done this without all of y'all who tune in and who support us from each week throughout these past 7 years. We've covered a lot of territory. As you see, we're trying to get back into the people before the politics. We've been covering a lot of politics around, these upcoming elections, and we're getting back to the people. Shout out to Cynthia Turnquest Jones, who first schooled me to the expression, was it bibliophile? Is that how you pronounce it? Which I had to check and see what that was, because I didn't know if that was a good word. I had to find out what that was when she said Timor was a bibliophile. And I just talked, she hit me earlier. I said, yeah, that term's been thrown around a lot today. So shout out to her. Shout out to everybody tuning in. Thank you, Bob, for scheduling this show. I just want to give him all, this was put together, this episode was put together by Bob. He scheduled the guests and put it together. And it has been the driving force behind the Decipher book, author, and lecture series that will be coming up at the library. So I implore everybody who's listening and who will listen to go out. Once again, say the date for it one more time, Bob, for everybody.
It's Thursday, August 26th at 6 p.m. It'll be in the library's fiction room. That is a room that is relatively underutilized. There's more than enough capacity for people to come in, socially distanced. So I invite everyone to come out and join us in person. We've only barely scratched the surface in today's discussion, and I know when Jeff has the floor uninterrupted, he's going to present us with a rich trove of evidence on Hubert Harrison's life and time. And I'll finally just note, everyone, that Harrison had a sojourn in the city of Mount Vernon. He lived on 7th Avenue for a spell. I think it was about 1907. This, again, I learned from reading Jeff's first volume. So there is a deep connection between Harrison's life and the city of Mount Vernon, and there's no better way that we could honor it, pay homage to it, than to come out and, hear Jeff elaborate more on Harrison's importance as a thinker and organizer.
I'd like to thank Dr. Jeffrey Perry for appearing on the show. I've learned a lot. I need to go back and listen to some of this again so I can take it all in. And I will definitely be looking forward to your presence at the library to learn a lot more. I will be looking a lot of this stuff up. You know, I think it'll be help me be more productive in what I do. You know what I'm saying? Because you got to know what came before you. I want to thank everybody else for tuning in. Again, this is People Before Politics, episode 312. We will be back next week. Dr. Bob has something else.
No, Jeff, did you want to say something else?
Yeah,
Jeff,
Dr. Bob, AJ, Timor, I can't thank you enough. I mean, not only did I enjoy doing this, but I really appreciated what you're doing here tonight. From the bottom of my heart, I think it's very important what you're doing, and you did it great. You're a real pleasure to work with, the three of you. I mean, I was smiling throughout, you know, from your comments, your thoughts, the way you handle things. You do a wonderful job. Thank you.
well, thanks so much, Jeff. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to close this show. We lost a legend in the Black community in Mount Vernon. Brother Ayers, he's gone, but he meant so much to so many, and we're going to find a way to pay tribute to him in Black Westchester, and hopefully on the radio show soon. Black Westchester would like to offer our condolences to the family and friends of Brother Alan Ayers. Those who know him know how much he meant to the community, and those that don't, we hope to educate you really soon on who he was and what he meant to the community. So I just didn't want to leave this show before we, said something about our brother, another lost brother, who meant a lot to the Black freedom struggle in Westchester, Mount Vernon, and beyond. So, I mean, Bob will talk more about that in a future episode. We will, properly pay tribute to him and celebrate his life. With that, that's about it. I thank everyone for tuning in. Until next week, we will be back. Make sure you pick up a copy of the anniversary issue that's out now, and the next one will be out around the 20th-ish, or shortly after. But we're working on it right now. Thank you very much. Until next week, peace. You are now tuned into the People Before Politics radio show, brought to you by the good folks at
Black Westchester.